Hi, good evening. Welcome once again to the Gildarie Freddie Kissoon show. We also coming to you on YouTube. You can get it there on the Guyanese Critic page also. Wherever you are, we want to say good evening, good night, and I hope that everything is going well. Please take care on the roadway. Tonight we don't want to have any delays. Interesting discussions tonight, and we have in our midst somebody who has been talking, who's been writing years and years. I grew up in the 90s, seeing him and another guy named Paul Tennessee. And of course, with the emergence of a grouping called Guard and Sam Hines and the rest of them, I grew up learning about these folks. And then I met this gentleman here when I joined the Kite News back in the mid 2000, the latter part of the 2000. And I'm not going to introduce him. My co-host will introduce him, Freddie Kissoon. So I don't want to waste any time because it's going to be interesting talking about where this country goes and how all could come on board and form that one Guyana or establish a one Guyana that our president, Irfan Ali, and his party has been preaching. Can we do it? Freddie Kissoon.
Good evening. Welcome to the show. As I always say, social media reduces the world to one small room. Our guest this evening needs no introduction. He has been a household name in Guyana for some time. Our guest this evening is Ravi Dev, and I'll tell you a little bit about Ravi Dev, and then we'll start to go into the recording of history. And if anyone is going to record history on the Gildarie Freddie Kissoon show, it's Ravi Dev. Ravi came back in the twilight of the 80s, when the 80s was near to end, back to Guyana. And he came fully armed, not with weapons of mass destruction, but fully armed with a theory, a sociological / plural / political theory called the Indian ethnic dilemma. Ravi argued in that theory that East Indians in Guyana are boxed in a dilemma. They have a problem with living in Guyana peacefully because the nature of the state is structured against their security. To adumbrate this theory, Ravi formed a group called Jaguar Committee for Defense. Then that Ravi was part of founding a group called GIHA, Guyana Indian Heritage Association. Then in 1998, Ravi Dev exploded in Guyana with his theory and his activism. I'm going to show you this book here, and I'm going to put it on the screen again, but let me tell you what happened in 1998. The PNC rejected the results of the 1997 elections, and there was ethnic mayhem. Indian people working in Georgetown had to leave, of course, to go across to the car park, to go up the East Coast, East Bank, and they were violently assaulted, and one indecent incident lacerated the soul of Indian people. A young lady, a young Indian girl, was stripped naked. Ravi Dev and his colleagues formed an organization called Guyanese Indian Foundation Trust, GIFT, GIFT. And GIFT did research into the disturbances of no fire, slow fire, in which hundreds of Indians were beaten up and robbed, and this is the result of the investigation and the research. It's called Civil Disorder of January 12, 1998, Documentation and Analysis. If you're the faint-hearted kind, do not read this. It's very, very tragic material you'll be reading. If you want to get a copy, if Ravi permits his cell phone to be publicized, then you can call him for a copy. After GIFT, Ravi Dev went into the direction of forming a political party. ROAR, Rise, Organize and Rebuild. And the Jaguar rode itself into parliament in the 2001 election, and Ravi Dev won a seat. That is the man for you. That is his history in a nutshell. But I've left out the most important thing for the last. From the time he came back in the 1980s, Ravi Dev has been writing profusely on the Indian ethnic dilemma, the world of Indian people, the dilemmas Indians face in all kinds of areas. So, with that long introduction, let me extend my hand to Ravi, something that Aubrey Norton doesn't like, but we know that is a basic courtesy. Ravi, thanks for being here. And there's one thing I have to say before I move into my first question. There is a missing link in your sartorial accoutrement. You have popularized the Nehru Shirjak, but I notice it's not here this evening.
Well, to make a confession here, I haven't been out for a while, and I'll tell you, the suit, you leave them there, you don't use them, they get faded. So my old Nehru suit is now faded. I'll have to go get some new ones.
So you're a vain man then. My first question, and Ravi, bear up with me, this is going to take a long introduction, but when the introduction is finished and I come to the question, your answer is going to take up the rest of the evening. Hopefully not.
So what are you going to do with Gildarie?
Oh no, Gildarie will come in. Don't worry, we wouldn't leave out Gildarie, but he'll understand. He's my friend. Gildarie, shut
Sometimes
up.
I
Gildarie, shut up. Ravi, as a dark-skinned Indian guy from South Georgetown, Wortmanville, I got my 5 GC and I went into UG in 1974. 2 years after UG moved from Queen's College. And I went into a different world in my own country. UG at that time was, the student population was 99% upper class children, middle class children, mostly the mulatto and the Creole. For the Indians, they were mostly clay complexion, middle class Indians. But what I found in that campus was the African middle class, the mulatto middle class, was disdainful of Indians. The Indians at UG never was encouraged to participate in, it's like if they were just, they were not supposed to be there. And unfortunate for me, on the campus, I joined, well I didn't join, but I became part of a middle class outfit called the Working People's Alliance, a very elitist outfit. Ravi, my experience at UG and WPA told me that there was something psychic about the Creole middle class, the clay complexion people, the Portuguese, about Indian people, is that they do not belong, they should not belong. And I believe that thing that existed in the 40s that I saw at UG as a student, as a dark-skinned Indian working class student, and I saw in the WPA, has not left Guyana, and I saw its ugly manifestation in the reaction to the March 2020 election, and it has changed my world. My question to you, Ravi, did what I see at UG and in WPA, is that a psychic embedment in the African Creole middle class?
Well, Freddie, let me just say this, that I don't think it is challenged by anyone, but basically our society was founded on race, and it was ruled along race, and it was developed along race, and fundamentally, we all know we don't have to be totally structuralist to accept the fact that these are, once something is embedded that deeply into all aspects of a country's history, it's not just going to disappear on its own. To put that in concrete terms, when the Europeans founded Guyana, they created a society, in our case where the Amerindians were brutalized in the jungle, and they brought in African slaves. or Africans whom they enslaved. And what developed here first by the Dutch and then perpetuated by the English on the plantations was a system where the whites were on top, unquestionably so, and you had the Africans literally slaves. There was that miscegenation where the whites then took African women, impregnated them. So you had a new development in Guyana, or in the Caribbean. Let's keep to Guyana. You had a new mulatto class. And this was the beginning of something very, very interesting. This mulatto class, in many instances, the sons were sent to England. They would have been trained in the professions in other media. So what happened in Guyana was the formation of a new structure where you had the whites undisputedly on top, but now you had an intermediate class called the colored, who were over the Africans. And that is something that still muddles the water in Guyana, because that class insisted that it was superior to the Africans and accepted subservience to the whites. So you have somebody like Edgar Mittelholzer, who wrote about that if you were in any way, he calls his novel, his autobiography, Swarthy Boy. So if you even had a touch of that darkness in you, you were seen as lesser. So it was not just the color thing, it was what it implied. So there was that compulsion, and there that remains that compulsion to now work your way up that color scheme. So to do that, you had to marry up, where Burnham, for example, left his first wife and took a colored woman, a mulatto woman. Yeah. You had to speak, quote unquote, proper. You understand? And you had to conduct yourself a certain way. So you were then, a dark-skinned individual like Burnham would then be accepted as quote unquote colored. I will not repeat it because he never gave me permission to do so. But one of the most respected black scholar activists, whatever you want to call him, told me fundamentally Burnham wanted to be white. That was his fundamental.
He's still alive?
I won't go into that. He's still alive.
He's still alive. Okay.
And that he wanted to be white. I think that what Du Bois in America calls that double consciousness, meaning the black man has to look at himself, but also look at himself through the eyes of the other, to the whites. But in Guyana, he has to look at himself through the eyes of the colored also. So you have Andai, she and I conducted many conversations on this topic. She was the swarthy one in her family. And, we all know this. She has written a book. She literally had a breakdown over this issue. So this is not something...
Yeah, she was dark-skinned.
Yeah, she was, her father was Dr. Williams, Burnham's doctor. But the point is that if you read her book, which is out, Trotz said it's the book.
The point is to change history.
Yes, she talks about this rather frankly. And this is something that is still there, I believe, and it's something that conflicts and is conflicted. So when you have the Indian being inserted into the equation, you see, when you have the Indian being inserted into the equation, you already had a sociological demarcation of the whites on top, and everything that was bad, everything that was negative was put into the black. The black did not have a soul. The black did not have a culture. The black is uncivilized. The black is a pagan. You understand? And to get out of that, they knew they would never become white. But at the very best, they could become colored. So even when you were colored now, you had that conflict. So that's why Marcus Garvey said you should cleave to the black. But very few cleave to the black. They still cleave to become the colored. And that colored class in Guyana, we have to do some studies here. We have to find out how powerful that is. I will close with this, and it shows you an indication. Between the 1992 census and the 2012 census, there was an anomalous jump in those who recorded themselves as mixed, and a reduction in those who classified themselves as African. Clive Thomas had to accept that such a jump could only be explained if many Africans chose to say they were colored. And that is something that we have to now explore. What will this? So when we talk about the mixed population increasing, it's not necessarily just because of intermarriage. It could be a reclassification.
People misinforming the nation.
Yes. In 1990, the last anthropologist to study Guyana, Brackett Williams, a MacArthur Fellow. You know, they call it the Genius Scholarship, right? You get $250,000 US just to do what you want. She came to Guyana. She lived on the East Coast, where she gave it a different name, but it's really Clonbrook, that whole area there with Clonbrook and so on. And she talked about these issues very frankly. By sociologically, she was of African descent, so she could literally look into these questions. And she gives you an insight from the inside as to how these things play out. And she called, the book is named Blood in My Veins, Stain in My Name, where literally this is a class of people who always go back to the blood in their veins. So if they have some Portuguese blood in their vein, they see themselves as superior. They see themselves as better. And interestingly enough, objectively, they achieve better. So that is a burden that the black man in Guyana still has to deal with. And what has happened is that we find that in Guyana, the Indian has become a scapegoat for that anger that is building up when you are told that you're not quite equal. And here is this individual, the Indians who were brought in. And when they were brought in, they were put at the bottom beneath the African, because they were doing African work that the Africans refused. So the Africans now had somebody they could now gloat over. Right? You're doing slave work. We can work when we choose. You are pagan. By that time, they had gotten, quote unquote, civilized, to be civilized and all of that. But when those Indians now, within a few generations, start to surpass you by forming a rice industry.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It's a recipe which remains to this day. Because also a sociological constant is that groups evaluate each other, right? A fellow named Festinger, he put forward that law in sociology that there's always that social comparison process. That in every society, even at the individual level, Freddie walks into a room and he sees somebody there more good looking than him, and you size up people like that. But kidding aside, groups do that. So in Guyana, we have a situation where the African individual is a very conflicted one, and the Indian has become a scapegoat for taking out that anger at many levels. And this is something we have to deal with. And January 12th was one such instance.
Before Gildarie come in, which he deserved to come in, or shall we shut him out?
No, we'll have... we two old men can't have this conversation. Let's have a young viewer.
Welcome to the young generation of Ghana. But he has to learn, so please teach him about Guyanese history.
Well, it was an interesting...
and very dangerous.
But I want to ask you, sir, I'm going to pretend to be the devil's advocate here.
Please do.
How relevant is that conversation to the young people who believes that the politicians that we have nowadays are capitalists by nature and they don't really care? They're going to capitalize on the ethnic insecurities that we have in this place, and they're going to seize power, take power by elections or whatever. And they're going to do their business because all about bribery and corruption. I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, a famous man, I'm not one of his followers, but it doesn't mean he's changed the course of the world. He said that men make their history. but not in circumstances of their making.
That's Karl Marx. And why you don't want to call his name? He's a great philosopher.
Well,
He's a great philosopher. If he called the man name.
yes. So the point is, though, Gildarie, is that these young people that you talked about, they might want to change the world, but they have to deal with the circumstances that they find themselves in. And for instance, take for example what came out of the Burnhamite dictatorship that Walter Rodney calls a totalitarian dictatorship. Walter even invoked the name of Hitler, but he said, we have to have a sense of proportion. Guyana doesn't have enough people like Germany to put it in terms of volume, but in terms of its nature, it's the same thing. Be as it may, during the Burnhamite regime, Burnham destroyed the rice industry by nationalizing it. You have to sell all paddy to the government, and he bought it at a very cheap rate, and then he formed mills that were run by his own people, graded the paddy by his own people, and then after it was milled, he then exported it, and the money that he got, which was higher money of course, was never passed on to those rice farmers, so that at the end of it, you had rice farmer ruined. By the end of his thing, rice production was cut by at least.
Was that deliberate, or was that an action taken by a government which wanted money that it wasn't getting elsewhere?
Well, it's not a matter of whether something is deliberate or not. A government, you see, in politics as in law, intent is not motive. It's different. Intent means when you do an act, you are supposed to be aware of the consequences of that act, different scenarios, and therefore you have to take responsibility. You get me? If a particular outcome is called negligence, nobody goes on the road intending to. But if you do something very careless, it's gross negligence. And now I understand you'll be charged in Guyana with the recent passage with manslaughter automatically. So coming back to this, the rest of the world had already shown that if you want to take agricultural surplus, you get me? You cannot do it in that manner. Other countries try to do it. You get me? America had done it before, and it was done in a way where the farmers have to be rewarded or they won't go back into farming. They got to be incentives. The secret is incentives if you want to produce. In sugarcane, in 1968, the sugar workers, my dad was a cane cutter. In 1968, they earned something called, they would call it profit sharing, right? And so for the first time, we grew up dirt poor. The first profit sharing of 1968, my dad and my mom was able to buy what we call a three-piece suit. Those leatherette thing? A settee. And you got a three-piece suit, and the next year you'd buy a table. In 1994, Burnham imposed a levy on the profits of sugar, when the sugar profits had gone to the levy. And so therefore, sugar workers stopped getting that profit out of sugar, out of their labor. And he used that based on what he wanted to. There was this dream of going up to, what do they call it, hydro, to have hydro. In fact, I once heard Father Rodriguez make a joke that Burnham wanted hydro, yes, and all of Guyana got hydro, if you know what I mean. So in each area...
I can't believe you said that.
Well,
that's out of character.
I couldn't believe Rodriguez said that. He was a Jesuit priest. Said it at the mayor's org meeting I went to. So to come back to it, in each area, whatever Indians were doing was destroyed. While, for example, he increased by over 1,000% the public service. You understand? The public service itself, or the proper public service, was increased eightfold. You're talking of the army, George Dance.
That was let me finish.
I'm coming to a point. The point is, however, at the end of that, in 1992, there was a household income and expenditure survey done by outsiders. You get me? And all of the individuals in Guyana were at a rate of poverty. Meaning that with all of that being extracted, the Indians were able to hold their own. You understand? They didn't go about, beating their heads and weeping and wailing, and there was gnashing of teeth. So what I'm saying is that against all odds, Indians, because of their own cultural background, because being immigrants, they came here to do better economically, they survived. And afterwards, when the PPP came into office, there was another HIES survey done in 1999, which showed, and Clive Thomas serialized this in the Starbuck News, it's out there, you can Google it anytime. By 1999, blacks had done better than Indians in terms of improving their lot. It means the PPP, whatever their policies were, had helped African Guyanese to a greater proportion than Indians. So when they say poverty was reduced from 46% in 92 to 35% in 96, when you disaggregate that, Afro-Guyanese were helped out of proportion to their numbers. You understand? But yet in those years, you have the PNC kept talking about discrimination, kept talking about ethnic cleansing, kept talking about house laws. The exact war cries you're hearing today were repeated by the PNC. So in 1997, you had the whole country breaking out and Indians being beaten, when in reality, by 1998, Afro-Guyanese had been helped out of poverty. You understand? So the point I'm making, coming back to what is the reality out there, we will have to, I go always by surveys. That was the difference when we came back to Guyana, a number of us in the Jaguar Committee for Democracy. You asked me a question as to how young blacks will feel. We will have to get actual surveys to see actually what is happening in terms of are they getting the benefits as they did between 1992 and 1999. And in fact, there was another survey in 2006, which again, their life improved without any acknowledgement, because by that time, you had bandits holed up in Buxton that were waging war on Indians and on the state itself. Yet, throughout that, the condition of Africans were objectively being improved. So the point is, I have been always calling, there's a paper in there that I wrote and I called for it, that there has to be ethnic impact statements. And therefore we can show that the government of the day, in this case the PPP, what is it doing with house lots? What is it doing in terms of actual contracts? What is it doing with anything of value?
I want to ask you this, Mr.
No, finish. So the point is, you see, we can't just talk about it, because in 1992 to 2006, when you ask the African Guyanese individual, he would say, we're getting nothing, we didn't get anything with all that, and you go out and you start beating up on people. The point is, everybody believes it's called subjectivity, based on what you were told, because subjectivity isn't a direct one-to-one with your experience. You could be told that you're that and you believe that. I listen to some of these talk shows and I wonder which country are we living in.
When the absence of that ethnic impact statement, how are we able to determine that Black or Indo-Guyanese are more discriminated against than Afro-Guyanese? Are we able to conclusively say something like that in the absence of that? That's
the point, you can't. And that is why
nobody has a case.
It is very irresponsible for leaders in a country that is so combustible as Guyana. And we just can't hope for the best in running a country. You got to plan for the worst. So what I'm saying is that in a country which has shown that literally open warfare can break out at any moment. I sat at Carol Lodge, that bottle restaurant with David Himes back in 1999. and he asked me when the riots were unleashed against Indians, boy, Ravi, what were Indians going to do? You get me? The American ambassador called me in. What are Indians going to do? The point is that here we are right now, and you have the same kind of drum beats being made, right, about discrimination. I now hear about something called emerging apartheid state. You know, insulting what has happened in South Africa since 1948 to 1994, and calling it apartheid. So to answer the question, you could have a lot of people listening to that nonsense and believing it. And if you listen to some of the call-in people on those shows, and I try to monitor it to know what's going on, they actually believe this thing, right? So we need hard data. So I've always called upon the PPP to let that information be out. I have been told that as best as what they think, going back to Chedi's time, they feel if you talk about ethnic goings on openly like that, you are reifying it, meaning you're giving it life. I don't believe so. When you don't talk about it, those who want to exploit, those people fear the same fears of being dominated and being excluded, will use those to whip up those fears. And you see, Freddie mentioned the ethnic security dilemma. I didn't just talk about the Indian ethnic security dilemma. I mentioned simultaneously that there's an African ethnic security dilemma. And this was articulated as early as 1965 by no other than the Nobel Prize winning economist from the Caribbean, Sir Arthur Lewis. In 1965, he was just about to become first chancellor of UG and all that. And he wrote, and it's there in his book, Politics of West Africa, he said, because the elections were then going on, the 64 elections, or 60-something elections, and he said, upon counting heads, and direct quote, upon counting heads, meaning elections, are the Negroes, in those days they still use the word Negro without being stoned, should the Negroes of Guyana, of British Guyana be exterminated? And that phrase has always remained with me, that a staid man like Arthur Lewis, out of the top universities of England and London, would use that there's that fear in him, seeing that blacks will be exterminated. So it comes back to this whole thing of being swamped and subordinated and even exterminated. There's that fear. So coming back to your thing, I don't know whether that fear has left young blacks. You know, on this one, the evidence will have to be presented to me, because I've heard this whole thing of youth thing at every elections. And I've been back, I came back 32 years now. I haven't seen it. I would like someone to show me where the election is. So that's my answer to your question.
Ravi, one of the things I'm keeping my eye on is when you let loose, and then we look at the time, parts of history would not be recorded. And I want, when researchers doing their research,
I can come back, Freddie.
Yeah, we will. No problem. We will definitely have you back. With your kind of intellectual background, but your involvement. One of the mysterious things I want to be seen, outlined in this program, is this thing about the WPA, Rupert Rupnarine, relation to the PNC when you were championing the third force. You have written a letter which has titillated my imagination, and I think it needs to be adumbrated here. You stated in that letter published in the newspapers that the negotiations with the third force were going on, you, the WPA, PNC. And while this was going on, Rupert Rupnarine was having his own conversation with the PNC, which you think was counterproductive, and you complained to Clive Thomas, who I think in a letter you said wasn't really receptive. Ravi, I'm asking you, what back then, what was the relationship between the WPA and the PNC? What was Rupert's motives? And why was the third force of which you were involved in trying to bring about? What caused it collapse? Fill that gap in Guyana's historiography.
Well, part of that historiography in terms of the WPA, I think we have to understand the WPA itself. That the WPA has always championed a position which I have critiqued from my entry into Guyana, because I was closer to the WPA at any time more than the PPP. You know, for every trip I made up to Freedom House, I would have made at least 20 trips to Rodney House. I was very close to the WPA. It's the only party I ever gave money to in Guyana, the WPA. So to come back to it, was very close to them. So I think one of the things we have to know is that the WPA, while it called itself as a coalition of Africans and Indian through IPRA.
Yeah. Indian Revolutionary Political Associate.
But Moses Bhagwan, and I'm making it clear in this forum here, I've written it, but I don't think many people have picked up on it. Moses told me clearly, because in 1970 I was doing A-levels at Indians, and I went to, and I've written this, went to Moses' office somewhere in Mirage Building or something like that.
Charlotte Street, Mirage
and we were very concerned as to the way the Burnhamite state was proceeding as early as that time. And a group of us, we had just walked out of Stokely Carmichael had said Black Power is only for blacks. And UC Guyana had invited Stokely, and to Ratoon's credit, they disassociated themselves from it, and myself and a bunch of other students we walked out from Queen's College where Stokely was speaking. And later I went to Moses' office and asked if we were looking to form a group to protect Indian. In fact, we had a name for it, Organization for the Protection of Indian Culture, OPIC. And this was before OPEC, OPIC. So Moses,
so many parties.
Moses,
the name Indian.
I was only 18 then. So the point is that Moses told me something which he confirmed later when I came back to Guyana, which is that his orientation that Indians were not culturally oppressed in Guyana. You understand? It was only a political thing.
Bhagwan said that?
Yes, to me. And I want this to go down in history. And he's still alive. He could, think that I've written it. Nobody seemed to have picked it up. He said he didn't see, and here was Walter coming back with the cultural oppression as a Pan-Africanist. Here you had Mr. UC Guyana as a Pan-Africanist, talking about the African dilemma, qua African, not only political, but as African. Yet the Indian component said he didn't see an Indian cultural oppression, that we were not peripheralized. And Moses, when I came back somewhere around the 90s, he and I sat at his veranda, and he confirmed that was his position then, and he never went in that direction. So to come back to
the nature of the WPA.
Right. So you come back to my friend whom I admired greatly at a particular point in time, Dr. Rupert, right? And Rupert told me the same thing. He said, Ravi, to be very clear, I grew up in a Georgetown where it was a Creole environment. He told me his first girlfriend was Creole. You get me? And at that time he was living in Mahaica. He made a statement. He said, even to today, Ravi, I am more comfortable in Mackenzie than in Mahaica. He was making an alliteration. You understand? And it sounded nice. The boy is he had a degree in Elizabethan literature out of Cambridge, so he could alliterate. So the point is that, you see, come back now to this third, I was trying to get what is called a center force, that in its name, it should position a group of Guyanese who are for Guyana between the two behemoths. So I was very careful about the name. It was Raphael and Kamraj.
Raphael Trotman,
Right, Ramzilan, who pushes the whole notion of a third force. I said the third, you are then just one of them. First force, second force, like third world. What is this? I said, state explicitly that you'll be in the center, there you'll have to remain in the center. And you work with which one?
You still have to tell us, you're coming up to what the nature of the WPA.
Right. So in the formation of that third force, and in my case the center force, we came together as a group. And that is the first time politically I was exposed to the enduring power of what I call the mulatto class. You understand? Because when I saw the maneuverings,
go on, Ravi, this is
when
interesting.
I saw the posturings as to what was going on, you understand? I could see that these were not individuals. I lost a lot of respect for some people in how they saw each other at that visceral level. I thought, I am an Indian, but intellectually, there's no way I can defend saying I'll ever vote for this man because he's an Indian. I can never and will never defend that. That whether you're Indian or whatever, you understand? That
It's pathetic you vote for people on issues.
on issues. So to come back to the point, it came down to a point.
And that was said, Ravi?
But I'll tell you how it was said. I put up, because Roar and Gap were there, and both of us were in Parliament. And Shirley Melville and I, Sheila Holder was there too. The three of us were like the three musketeers sitting on one side in the opposition benches. And I always remember, I always sat on the opposition benches, always, my 5 year in Parliament. So when we sat there, I then, within our discussion, said, I would like that this country put its money where its mouth is, that the indigenous people of Guyana must have real representation. And why can't we put Paul Hardy as the indigenous leader of this country, as the leader of the third force or of the center force? And that was the manner in which that was rejected. You understand? And certain people, talked about how you put a Bachman. You understand?
These were enlightened politicians saying that word.
Yes.
The word Bachman was used?
At different occasions. So the point I want to make is that when the thing actually broke down, because of these flirtations with the PNC, where Rupert was heavily involved in, I used to go up to many times to meet Rupert myself at Rodney House up Atlantic. Was that
Atlanticville.
Okay.
Next to
So
Cummins Lodge.
So to come back
That's
to
the
it,
industry.
yes, it was not just the flirtation with the PNC that broke it. It was their position vis-a-vis Roar's position. Because I wrote the document, and I have it, the principles of the third force or the center force. And there were 6 principles that I myself articulated and Rupert signed off on. You get me? But at the end of the day, it broke down because we heard, now this one I can't vouch for, we heard that Rupert in Washington were meeting with PNC types. You understand? And when he came back, that the whole would have gone nowhere. The whole effort would have gone nowhere. And so said, so done. That was what happened.
Gildarie, could you please indulge me, because history is being recorded here. And I did say when we were talking before the show began, I want to get as much from this man. Ravi, how could Rupert have taken those positions? He gave an interview with a paper called The West Indian in which he said, David Granger's always been my friend. I've always been my close friend. How could Rupert have taken this position, yet be so close to Walter Rodney, and David Granger was deputy in the army? This is confusing. He is a friend of David Granger, and he said in the book, Walter Rodney, A Promise of Revolution, we were stockpiling arms to overthrow the government. And then he takes this position with the PNC. What is going on there? Was Rupert really a mysterious figure in the WPA?
Well, let me just say this. First of all, David Granger was not just in the army at a high level. In 1979, when Burnham concluded that Walter had penetrated the army, and he had direct evidence of that because he had his spies in the WPA, as we all know, he moved David Granger to become the commandant of the GDF. People forget that. In 79, at a crucial moment when Walter had called for a revolution by Christmas, and when Walter would have been assassinated the year. I came back to this country for the first time. I had left in 72. I came back for the first time in 79, right? December. And I had my own conversations. So because right next door to me, in de Willem Zeeburg, where my family originated from. My great-grandfather was bound to Divilan. Though there were the 15 individuals who were arrested and tortured. You understand? Because they had been found with arms as being part of the WPA. In 79, you remember them, the 15? And in fact, I interceded because Rupert once wrote that the PNC had never tortured anybody. And he talked about Bateson and so on. And I pointed out that those individuals were tortured. And you see, even Rupert said there was no torture. And I said, and then Mr. Guayana, to his credit, confirmed, yes, those individuals were tortured because it's a matter of the historical record. So Rupert's relationship with the PNC, I myself am not that, haven't gone into that here to know that personality, but there are some subtext that needs explanation.
I want you to continue, but I want to tell you what Dr. Josh Ramsamy said to me at a Guystack building opposite the headquarters of Traffic in Kingston. Traffic is over there, and across the Parade Street was this building. And he was the then pro-chancellor of the university. And he said this to me, I'll never forget it. And when I look back at the WP and how Walter Rodney lost his life, these things are lacerating your psyche. He said to me, Dr. Josh Ramsamy, one of the founders of the WPA and one of the big leaders in the WPA, said to me, there's something about Rupert and the PNC. There's something about him and the PNC that I don't know what it is about, but there's always been something with him and the PNC. I mean, didn't Rodney see these contradictions? Rodney embraced him and he was the most trusted lieutenant of Rodney.
Well, you know, Shakespeare in the 1600s talked about et tu, Brute.
Yeah.
It's those from within who can betray. But I want to finish this whole thing about Rupert. Because
go on,
I was in Parliament in that 8th Parliament between 2001 and 2006 when there was a call for the first inquiry, COI, into the murder of Walter Rodney. And in fact, I participated in that. In fact, the PPP castigated me because the motion was framed, a motion for the commission of inquiry into the assassination of Walter Rodney. And the PNC made the point, and I accepted it and voted for it, that you can already conclude ahead of time it was an assassination. One could talk about the murder, you understand, but you can't talk about an assassination.
I remember that. It was in the
I
press.
voted, and I voted that. But the point is, after that, that whole effort was torpedoed by Rupert Rupnarine of the WPA. His point was that the PPP would use the findings for politicking aims. But this is a matter of the leader of one of the greatest historians, greatest human beings, you get me, the country has produced. And you have an opportunity upon the request by the family, because he was the go-between between the commission and us and in the opposition and the family. So we were told that the family didn't want it.
I read about that. You said that. Gildarie, I beg again for your indulgence.
You want to continue this thing, or
you're going to come in after this? I want to ask one question, then we're going to go to
Should I answer him?
Yes, you have to answer him. I'm going to put him out.
You can tell me. Should I answer him?
Let him answer. Ravi, I had some bitter disputes with Moses Bagwan over the past years. I told him in no uncertain terms, I don't want anything to do with him. He had sent me a book about his family legacy, and I was so disgusted with him over the March 2020 election. I told him I have given away the book to Mike Khan, the former administrator of the hospital. I don't want anything to do with Bagwan. I want your take, and then Gildarie is going to take over. I want your take. I believe Rupert Rupnarine and Moses Bagwan resented however they think they were, however they saw themselves. I think they saw Jagan as standing in the way of being the foremost Indian leader in Guyana. And that mental thing they had about Jagan, I think led them into the bosom of the PNC.
Well, I wouldn't want to speculate on that. We know that Moses Bhagwan, why he publicly broke from Jagan, at least we know that. That's theirs in the press.
Right.
In terms of his, he and Brindley Ben both feeling that Jagan was not radical enough at that juncture. Now, so I would pose the question to you that if both of them felt that the Indian did not have any kind of cultural oppression, that it was mere misfortune that he happened to be politically excluded. So in fact, it goes back to the question that Burnham posed to Jagan when Jagan accused him of being a racist in the 17 points in 1977 when they were discussing a merger. Burnham, turns to him and asks Jagan, he said, comrade, what is the socialist content of race? The point I want to make is that those two gentlemen in a during race, as a measure of their involvement, would they still want to mobilize or be recognized on that basis? You feel so? I feel they didn't want. You see, this. In fact, I had argued about the WPA in particular, that they wanted to be that platonic gods in the abstract that were above race. That's the picture they tried to transmit. When in fact, in the context of Guyana, they were all now leading to one side. Because if within the WPA you accept Walter Rodney's definition of himself as a Guyanese, but also as a Pan-Africanist, and you are saying that it doesn't matter for Indian, in that sense now you're letting the whole center of gravity shift to a particular outcome in who you should support. And ultimately, it is the PNC who is the legitimate supporter of that tendency.
Yeah, I would answer your question by saying I don't think they try to rise above the mundane of Guyanese society and think they were platonic and they were multiracial. I think at a very psychic level, the WPA was a hidden Creole middle-class elite. And I think it was led, ironically, by an Indian man. I've always felt Rupert Rupnarine was a Napoleon character.
But I'm confirming that the man told me that. That he's more Creole, that he's Creole. He told me that. So there's no secret about that. If he's alive, he can dispute me. Like he told me he's more comfortable in.
I've just seen Gildarie watching at his watch.
Yes.
I withdraw.
Yeah, boy.
I want to make a statement. I was in the midst of Kaitur when that whole formation of the AFC and the APNO and everything came up, and it was always my impression, again, in the absence of evidence, that the motivations of why there was a coalition was because here was an opportunity for us to enter power. It had nothing to do with, I could be wrong, it had nothing to do with the history between Rupert Ryan and that. It's just that AFC, Comrade Ramjet and Moses Nagamutu and the rest of them, it was always based on the conversations that I had with some of the leaders, the interviews that we would have done, that we could go by ourselves or we could go with the APNO and try to make changes. I believe that the motivations were good at that point in time that we get in, we try to make changes. Somewhere along the line, things became blurred, money, power, everything, and we know power, absolute power corrupts. But I want to ask this question before I go. There's an interesting thing that is happening with the Irfan Ali government. Mokko, Buxton, and we see recently something that happened at Belladrum. There's a campaign by the PPP to really make inroads, putting in resources, changing the lives of the people. I think we had a conversation about this. Do you believe, based on the evidence on the ground, what you would have heard, because we don't have any evidence to maybe analyze it, that the PPP government is going to make significant inroads by plunging resources, by changing people's lives in these traditionally PNC strongholds? Well,
let me preface my answer, because like I said, everything has to be placed in context, right? The circumstances in which we try to make history. So we have to understand that there's been a seismic change in Guyana's politics, sociology, economics, everything, because of the new demographics. When I wrote this, Indians
Put it
were
up
a
on the screen.
majority. Indians were a majority, and a lot flows out of that. We have a situation where we're a nation of minorities, and now the ethnic voting is not going to disappear. There will always be a certain amount of people who will change, but by and large, it doesn't happen overnight and at all. Because, for example, Sri Lanka has had ethnic problems, and the Sinhalese have been there for 2,000 years. Basically, to come back to which we aren't that long ago. So to come back to our situation, the situation that either of the two behemoths, if they want to win, has to attract votes from the other side, so to speak. So what the PPP is doing is rational, and I wrote a letter about this. Now, I wrote this 10 years ago, a letter in this week's Starbuck News, right? That in the Kaishur News, I used to write, I had my column there, and I wrote a column advising in 2010 that the opposition has to ameliorate their position and try to attract crossover vote. In fact, I debated the same Freddie Kissoon here, who at that juncture had adumbrated a theory of elected dictatorship. And I felt that was a polarizing description, because if you're a dictatorship, the government of dictatorship, it implies that you really can't get them out, and you may need to get them out by arms. Yes, it may. So I advised that, and I wrote that. The point I want to make is that I told it because by that time we had done our own surveys, and the demographics had changed. What it is today, 10 years later, after the PNC forming APNU got rid of its name, coalesced with the AFC, got into power by using that methodology, you have an opposition led by Aubrey Norton, who is doing everything to shoot himself in the foot by coming on with
He's not going to like
pugilistic. No, I like Aubrey. I would hope.
It's going to be an argument just saying that. He's shooting himself in the foot every day.
Yes, I wish Aubrey well. I know him.
So they're going to make inroads.
That's the point, because you see, I mean, the inroad may not be large, but in Guyana you don't need a large inroad. What separates the two parties is a mere 5,000 to 8,000 votes. You understand? So if take, for example, in my area, I live not far from the Namstel. The PPP has entered the Namstel. They were able to field candidates for the NDC from the Namstel. It means that they have at least 30 people in the Namstel who could sign the form. That's a group in the Namstel. Traditionally, in the last elections from 92 to 2020, the PPP has never gotten 8 votes in the Namstel.
Ravi,
So I'm saying, at least I know they'll get 30 votes.
Time is going.
Time is gone.
I think there are only two.
No, yeah.
I think there
we
were
know
only-
the time now.
No, we got more time. I think there were only 2 persons. When you read the newspapers, they mention the philosophers from ancient time right to now. You and I. My favorite philosophy book is by Martin Heidegger.
I know.
Being in Time. I think he explains more powerfully for me than any philosophy book what is the purpose of human existence, how you should shape it, what you should do with your life in when you're existing. What is your favorite philosophy book?
The Bhagavad Gita. It's in the field of battle. It begins with
Well, I recognize it's
Dharma
a good philosophy.
Kshetra,
Yeah.
Kurukshetra. That in the field of Dharma covers all life, all the rules of life, everything. But in the field of battle, meaning there's a conflict going on. And all these things are tested in conflict. So I found that it's a text that offers very, very solid advice, because Hindu does not have an absolutist moral rules. Let me finish. You can say it's deontological, it talks about duty, but also that the good comes before the right, meaning we must know what we are trying to do before we say this is right or that is wrong. So it's deontological. And so the Bhagavad Gita is deontological. It states what is the good, what we are striving for.
Time must catch up on us.
Yes.
Why you don't like Marx, man? I think Marx was very
I like
powerful.
Marx. I like
No,
Marx.
I
He's
think
not
you
my
said
favorite.
earlier, oh, he's not your favorite.
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately,
Next, we have to have you next time.
No, absolutely.
The thing is coming next time. The Nehru or the
Yes,
Modi,
yes, no,
or the
the
Modi.
Nehru.
Is there a Modi?
No, Modi now has the vest only. He's cut off the arms, and he only uses the vest part.
So you come in next time on the program, which will be very soon from now, with
And you won't point
Nehru
out,
or Modi.
and you won't point out that it's faded, and cause me great embarrassment in our public.
Well, I know this suit. I know this suit looks expensive.
It is very expensive.
ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we have
This
reached
is the way.
at the end of the time, and it was interesting for me. I have become a student of history here now. Interesting times, interesting people who played what role, who said what, and Ravi seems to be, or struck me to be somebody who has institutional knowledge, and this is good. We want to understand what went on, who played what roles. We have to talk to the people who know. Could we dare hope that sometime or the other that we could have a discussion that where there's no ethnic division, that we could vote on issues rather than whether we're Indians or whether we're blacks? Could we do that? Those are the kind of topics that we should be discussing. Could we start talking about policies? How do we stand on abortion or on gun laws, or whether this government has a good policy with regards to immigration? Are those good things? We could go on and on and on, but I want to say thank you very much to my co-host Freddie Kissoon, and of course to somebody I've read over the years. Don't agree with him at all times. I think I even saw Enrico Wolford want him to be taken before the Ethnic Relations Commission recently for giving his views on a particular topic. But that is how discussions come. We can agree to disagree. Ladies and gentlemen, have a pleasant rest of the night. We're going to be back with you on Wednesday, and of course we're going to have Mr. Ravi back here right in the studio to continue the conversation as to where we headed as a country. And I want to say thank you again to my co-host Freddie Kissoon. Till Mr. Dave.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You want to shake me out or what?